Interview with Gerald Stone, take one.
What?
Oh, well.
Can you explain? You want to go again, or what?
No, go ahead.
Can you explain why journalists, cameramen go into a war zone?
Usually because it's the best story around, and most journalists want to cover the best story that's around.
Can you explain what you meant by and mention the Mayo image?
Well, people, no matter what profession you're in or how exciting it seems to be, is usually filled with a lot of ordinary routine. Suddenly you find yourself in a situation where there's no such thing as routine. Of course, there's a lot of routine in the Army, but it's quite a different routine than you've ever seen before. There's men facing danger, there's men risking their lives all the time, and there's this tremendous feeling of camaraderie that you're sharing this danger that everybody else is sharing.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain what that German photographer meant by the boom boom?
Horst Faust, an Associated Press photographer who, along with Neil Davis, I think saw more action than any other person in the war, used to say, I know it's terrible, the blood, the guts, the killing and everything, but there is nothing as exciting as that boom boom. He was a German fella, and what he meant was the sound and the feel of war.
Mm-hmm. You say that war is fun. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it does sound a terrible thing to say, but you are actually, from the moment you're waking up to the moment you're going to sleep, you're filled with a sense of excitement. It's your adrenaline that is coming up. You're working very hard. You really do work very hard. You're subjected to conditions that would seem impossible, with, for instance, being thirsty, or being hungry, or being mosquito bitten, and then being shot at as well. And then you file a story which you know is a good story because all these things have happened to you. You go out and you have a big dinner and a lot of drinks, and you're ready for the next day. Now that's fun.
Can you explain, or do you think that journalists tend to hide behind the shield of objectivity as an excuse for shutting off to the pain and suffering they see?
I think some journalists do, but the best journalists I've ever met are not cynical. I don't even know where this term, the cynical journalist, comes along, because all of the veteran reporters I know are fellows who have continually kept themselves open to life, who can feel the suffering around them, and that's what makes them good reporters. It may seem very brutal that they don't participate when they see somebody lying on the ground bleeding, that they don't go and help them, or somebody who's poor and they don't suddenly stop and give them money. But at the same time, their reporting is their way of expressing what's going on, and they're expressing a great testament to humanity, I think.
Can you outline that incident where you're at the floating restaurant?
Yes. In 1965, Murray Wilmont, still photographer, and I had gone to cover the Australians' landing. We were having dinner in a hotel when there was a large explosion. And a floating restaurant about 3 blocks away, the Mekong floating restaurant, had 2 bombs go off, one in the restaurant, and as people started to run out, there was another bomb exploded, Claymore mines. The street was filled with about 50 dead and dying people. We were the first team on the spot. Maury started taking pictures. Suddenly we saw that one of the men laying on the ground, bleeding very badly, crying for help, was an RCA technician, a fellow who Maury knew very well because he was in charge of moving the pictures out of Saigon. Maury had that decision to make in the instant. Was he going to help this man who he knew, or was he going to take pictures that could never be taken again? And he kept up with those pictures, and I think it was a good decision.
How can you justify that?
I think it's justified on the basis of asking, what were you there in Saigon for, or Vietnam? You weren't there to suddenly fall apart at the first scene of violence or terror that you saw. You were there to do a job as a reporter or a cameraman, and particularly in the case of a cameraman who has only got an instant to take his pictures. A reporter, as I did, could go and help and write my story afterwards, but a cameraman is only there once. Those things are only happening once, and his pictures were played around the world.
If you hadn't have been there, though, would you still go along with the principle of he keep on filming?
Oh, undoubtedly. If I was his news director and he didn't film, I would sack him.
And what happens if you had been the one on the ground calling out for help?
I think Murray would only have had a slightly more complicated decision. He would have had to ask, if I don't help him, what's the chances of continuing my coverage in Vietnam? Am I going to lose a reporter, or can I get another one to replace? That's all.
Isn't that cynical, though? You say the good journalist.
It's not cynical. It's what you've dedicated your profession to. Every profession has its tremendous moral problems. A priest who hears the confession of somebody who's committed murder, a lawyer who has to defend somebody he thinks is guilty. With a journalist, you believe that what you're doing in the long run is going to be good for your society, even though it has some short-term problems. And one of those short-term problems is seeming to be cruel or uncaring.
What was the irony of the story in the end?
Well, it turned out to be very ironical. It wasn't just that particular RCA man, but two of his colleagues. The whole RCA office was shut down. Murray couldn't get his pictures out for 3 to 4 days afterwards. So as it turned out, his decision was delayed.
Do you think that journalists are in love with war and the idea of battle?
No, not all journalists.
Those who cover the war, so.
Well, the ones who stay on to cover it, yes, they have a strange love-hate relationship. If you ask any journalist, he would probably tell you, oh no, I hate wars, and I think it was terrible, and I hated to see the sights that I saw. But at the same time, I think every one of them, if they were being honest, would say that that was probably one of the most thrilling things that he's ever done in a journalistic assignment. And there are a group of reporters who go from war to war to war. Their papers recognize this, because if you were good in Vietnam, you suddenly end up in Africa, like Neil Davis ends up in Africa, or any place that there is trouble.
Do you think they lose their sensitivity because of this?
Well, as I say, I think that as much as they lose their sensitivity, they limit themselves as a reporter. If you take a guy like Neil Davis, I've never met a more sensitive or caring person than him. And that's what gives him a tremendous perspective, is able to look. You see, a lot of times people get into a war situation and they say, there's the enemy and there's us, right? And that's the way a lot of wars were reported, the horrible, vicious enemy, and here's our brave troops. I think in Vietnam and wars, the little wars that have happened after that, you've got this perspective of we're all in it together, that the Americans and the Viet Cong were suffering together. And so you have reporters talking about human beings, not about Americans or Viet Congs, but about the human condition. And I think that's one step up the ladder of reporting.
What's your opinion of Neil Davis?
Well, I think he's the finest journalist I've ever worked with. Not only is he very good in his own profession and his own stories, but he also gives tremendous help to anybody who comes along and says, here I am, I've just flown into Rhodesia, and he'll go out of his way to help you find contacts and so on.
Do you think he's got a certain feeling of invincibility?
I don't think he would think he has a certain feeling. Anybody looking at him and his record would say that, yes, he must have that feeling. But I don't think Neil ever thought about it. Neil was just doing what Neil does best. It was one of the ironies of being a good reporter in Vietnam that as you develop your contacts, you suddenly found yourself getting into action more and more. People would call up Neil Davis at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, look, our battalion is going into the spot, and we've got a spot on the helicopter for you. And he was going in before, you know, in the front line of the troops. And he loves filming, and that's what he was best at, and that's what he did.
Can you explain the story you told about the time he was very seriously wounded?
Well, it's probably best coming from Neil, but
how he liked it.
It was very impressive. Neil was wounded very badly in Cambodia. He and a group of people were standing around in a circle, and a mortar shell dropped in the middle of them. He said it was like a Sam Peckinpah movie. Everything happened in slow motion.
Yeah. Can't continue.
Yeah, sure. He said that he could look across and see one man, and he knew at an instant that man falling back was dead because he could see his face sort of disintegrating in front of him. Another man he knew was badly wounded in the shoulder. He himself felt his own wounds and where he was, which I think was in the leg, and all that in this moment when this mortar shell burst.
Mm. Can you tell me what type of journalists, news editors like to send to Vietnam?
When I first got to Vietnam in '65, it was strange. I looked around, and most of the reporters were police rounds. And you'd ask yourself, well, what does the police rounds have to do with this war? But I think that editors, having this war break around them and saying we want to send somebody, looked around their staff, and the people that seemed most likely were the guys who had worked with the police, who knew a little bit about guns and weaponry and so on. And I think this gave a limitation, a definite limitation to coverage, because police roundsmen as good as they may be, are not necessarily the most intellectual types, and they don't necessarily look for the political or diplomatic ramifications.
Did the media, television in particular, live up to its responsibility in public opinion?
Yes, I think that no, there was no doubt that we did not live up to our responsibility. But then you consider it was a tremendous responsibility. It was the first time that television had ever been so closely involved in a war, or for that matter, journalism, where you were invited to every front and you could actually go and see battles taking place in front of your eyes. It was a tremendous responsibility, but I think that in the first place we tended to handle it superficially. That is, as police roundsmen, simply concentrating on the bodies. Yes.
Okay, Marcus. Interview with Gerald Stone, take 2.
Can you tell me,
Okay, come through.
you said before news editors didn't really present all the gore, the blood. Can you go to elaborate on that, please?
Well, I think that although people didn't like to say, but they observed that it was the first war that seemed to unfold in the living room, that you saw bodies and blood. But it really, what the people were seeing was a sanitized version. Nobody ever really saw guts hanging out of a man or his brain hanging out. The news editor, this was being shot, but the news editors back home were making a tasteful version of horror rather than the actual horror. So I wonder whether the people in the living room really ever did see what war was like. They saw a kind of version of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do a few noddings.
Right. You were news director at the time when the journalists were sent to Timor.
Yes.
And as a result, several of them were killed.
Well, 2 of my journalists, yes.
How did you feel about that? How do you live with that responsibility?
Well, it's a terrible thing to live with, that you realize that 2 young guys that were alive before you sent them on assignment are suddenly dead. And I don't think I'll ever really erase that thought from my mind. And yet there's no doubt in my mind that both those fellows wanted to go, as many fellows in our newsroom did, because it was a good story. As news director, you try to take every precaution to make sure that you don't send people into impossible situations. We looked at the risks, we talked about it. The cameraman who went and was subsequently killed had been with me, and we thought it was a risk worth taking.
Mm-hmm. You said before that people you have everyday dealings with, they BS, and you don't particularly like having to go through that, but with the soldier in the field, there's a common rapport. Can you explain what you meant by that?
As a journalist, whether you're in television, newspapers, you talk to an awful lot of people who talk, well, frankly, bull or bullshit. They're either politicians or businessmen that are always trying to put a rosy picture on what they're doing. Suddenly you're in the field and you're talking to soldiers who know that they may not come out of their experience within a couple of hours or within a couple of months. So the things they're talking about seem very real indeed. They're talking about girls, they're talking about food, they're talking about what they want to get back home. And you have this refreshing feeling that you're really hearing people talk about what they feel rather than what they think they should feel.
Think that wars are inevitable, they'll come and go no matter what?
Yes, I think wars are inevitable and will come and go. I don't know whether that's due to a basic flaw in mankind. I think different wars start for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain the gap between people seeing on television the blood and the gore and not accepting the need to change their view?
I think one of the most worrisome things to come out of the Vietnam War, and it's still being debated now, is exactly what impact did the television coverage have. Some people suggest that it made, it speeded up the anti-Vietnam movement and brought the war to a speedy end. And yet there have been studies that would suggest that that wasn't the case at all, that people seeing the war coming in their living rooms became immune to it, began to treat it just like an ordinary detective story or serial, and didn't care. And I do have that very nagging feeling in the back of my mind whether people confronted with a nasty situation but in the nice atmosphere of their living room don't suddenly become accustomed to something that they should be really horrified about.
Is there any way that television can change its tactics so that it can live up to its responsibility?
Well, it always will start with more perceptive and better reporters. Reporters who don't get so easily carried away with the actual battlefield type of thing and can bring a little perspective. I think eventually when people start reporting war as a human condition, not as a we and they, it will get better. But it's difficult.
Yet that goes against the journalist's grain of objectivity. Why do journalists pride themselves on being objective? And are they?
Well, I don't know. That term objectivity has taken a great beating. Vietnam was a prime example of it. For example, were you really being objective reporting the American body count? I mean, the Americans saying that we killed 42 Vietnamese today and 52 yesterday. That might seem to be objective, but then when you realize that you weren't reporting the fact that for every South Vietnamese who was killed, they left 4 rifles behind on the battlefield compared to the Viet Cong won, that was really another fact that should be reported. But I think you try to be fair. I think you recognize your biases and try to be fair, and that's the important thing.
Can you just say something about the 2 schools of thought and the development?
Yeah. And Vietnam was one of the starting points, I think, for a new field of journalism, which is called subjective journalism, where the journalist feels that he can't really disassociate himself from what he's involved in. He's either for it or against it. And he has to stand up and be counted, so that he should come out and say, this is the report from a journalist who is very much against the Vietnam War, and what I'm going to tell you is from the side of somebody who thinks that you should understand how lousy war it is. Now, originally that would seem to be completely against the code of journalism. He'd be fired if he was in a lot of newsrooms. But I think we have started to accept that there is no such thing as true, solid objectivity, that everybody does have biases. And I think the mark of a professional journalist is to recognize his biases and compensate for them.
So really objective reporting as it concerned the Vietnam War was not on?
Well, it was no more on in the Vietnam War than any other type of reporting. It was a subjective choice of many things you could report, and you always ended up reporting a few that you selected, a few things, a few facts.
Were there any incidents at all of a humorous nature in Vietnam that particularly come to mind, and humour in the part it played in the war?
I can't say that there was any humorous incident. There certainly was a kind of a humorous patter that went through all your conversations, and it was sort of this feeling that here today and gone tomorrow. And certainly I had some of the best dinner parties and drinking sessions that we ever had with fellows who shared that type of thing. But I can't recall any particular humorous stuff.
Can you think of what it was like, explain to me what it was like coming back from a very close shave and relaxing?
Yeah, there's never a feeling like it. Vietnam was one of the few wars, in fact the only war, where you could be...
Okay, interview with Gerald Stone, take 3.
It seems strange, maybe even a little hateful, to talk about war as fun, but there was just no doubt that it was fun. When you think that even as a journalist you run into a lot of ordinary routine, and then suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you're out marching with men, knee-deep in mud, possibly going hungry or not having water, people shooting at you, and you're feeling this, I hate to say it, but a Mako, a sense of sharing, a very masculine thing, men confronting their own selves. That's what danger is. And of course, as a journalist, then you were able to leave that situation. You were able to take your story back, know that you got a good story, come back to your hotel, have a nice wash or shave, have a beautiful dinner, a lot of drinks, and talk about what was happening and what you were going to do tomorrow. Now that was really exciting stuff, and I think that any journalist, if he was prepared to look at himself, would admit that it's probably one of the most exciting times of his life to be in a war.
Would we end wars then if we were to have women as presidents of countries?
Never. In fact, especially if you looked at the Vietnamese women, some of the toughest women I ever met in my life. And I don't think that men or women are different in that sense. They still love the excitement. There's no doubt in Rhodesia, I talked to people who said that they thought that the war, as terrible as it had been for the white Rhodesians, had made their life interesting. And anybody who's seen Rhodesia would understand what they meant.
Okay.